In the history of the United States, few figures have inspired such admiration and fear at the same time. He was revered for his astonishing ability to create wealth at breathtaking speed, and feared for an ambition that seemed to know no limits. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, a man often described as the richest of the rich. From digging potatoes for just 4 cents an hour, Rockefeller would go on to design and command a vast industrial empire, founding one of the most powerful dynasties America had ever known, and accumulating a fortune estimated at $3 billion in his era. But what kind of childhood forges such a man? What experiences shape a character so disciplined, so devout, yet so ruthless? In this film, we uncover the hidden origins of an extraordinary life and the childhood that gave rise to one of the most powerful families in American history. On January 10, 1870, in Cleveland, Ohio, a 30-year-old businessman and his partners formally incorporate a new enterprise, the Standard Oil Company. In the years that follow, they expand far beyond their initial $1 million investment, systematically acquiring smaller oil companies and refineries across Ohio and beyond. By 1890, Standard Oil is valued at $100 million and controls more than 90% of oil production in the United States. By the time he steps away from the company, its founder has become, for better or worse, one of the richest and most influential figures in American history, and indeed in the world. His name? J.D. Rockefeller, the world's first billionaire. The man history would come to know as John D. Rockefeller was born John Davison Rockefeller on July 8, 1839, in the small town of Richford, New York. Rockefeller was the second of 6 children born in Richford, New York, to con artist William A. Rockefeller Sr. and Eliza Davison. Rockefeller had an elder sister named Lucy and 4 younger siblings, William Jr., Mary, and fraternal twins Franklin, Frank, and Francis. His father was of English and German descent, while his mother was of Ulster Scot descent. One source says that some ancestors were Huguenots, the Rockefeller family, who fled to Germany from France during the reign of Louis XIV in a period of religious persecution. By the time their descendants immigrated to North America, their name had taken German form. William Sr. worked first as a lumberman and then a traveling salesman. He claimed to be a botanic physician who sold elixirs and was described by locals as Big Bill and Devil Bill, a euphemism for his habit of making fake medicines from herbs in his mother's garden and claiming their potency to cure all sorts of ailments. Quack doctors of this kind were very common in the early 19th century. An all-around con artist, William subsequently used the money he made from selling his supposed medicines to loan out money at usurious rates to poor farmers, often with the specific aim of later acquiring their properties when they could not pay him back. An unscrupulous character, he would later be arraigned in court for sexual assault and violent conduct involving gun possession. Unshackled by conventional morality, he led a vagabond existence and returned to his family infrequently. In late 1836, while William Rockefeller was roving around the countryside near Richford, he met Eliza Davison and charmed her with his wild tales. In February 1837, the couple were married, despite the fact that Bill was already engaged to a beautiful but penniless woman named Nancy Brown. Throughout his life, Bill was notorious for conducting schemes. In between the births of Lucy and John, Bill and his mistress and housekeeper Nancy Brown had a daughter named Clorinda, who died young. Between John and William Jr.'s births, Bill and Nancy had another daughter named Cornelia. Eliza was the quiet pillar of the household. A deeply devout Baptist, she struggled to preserve a sense of order and stability, while her husband, Bill, was often gone for long stretches of time. In his absence, Eliza endured his infidelity and the secret double life he led, one that ultimately included bigamy. Around 1855, Bill abandoned the family for good, choosing to live with his second wife, Margaret L. Allen, leaving Eliza to raise the children alone. By temperament and by necessity, Eliza was frugal. She believed waste was a moral failure, often reminding her son that willful waste makes woeful want. From an early age, she taught John the discipline of saving money, tracking every cent, and understanding its value. He contributed to the household by doing daily chores and earning extra income, raising turkeys, selling potatoes and candy, and eventually lending small sums to neighbors. From his father, John heard the harsh lesson to trade dishes for platters and always come out ahead in any deal. Bill once boasted, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make 'em sharp." But it was Eliza's quiet consistency, not Bill's cruelty, that shaped John most deeply. As he grew older, John distanced himself from his father, later reflecting, "From the beginning, I was trained to work, to save, and to give." When John was 3 years old, the family moved to Moravia, 3 miles away from the Davison farm. In 1843, Eliza gave birth to another daughter, Mary Ann, and in 1845, twins, Frank and Frances, the latter of whom died just before her second birthday. In spite of his unscrupulous business practices, Bill Rockefeller achieved a level of respectability for a time during the 1840s in the town of Moravia, and helped finance the foundation of the local school. At the same time, he considered farm work beneath his dignity, and the 2 elder boys, John and William Jr., were soon required to do much of the manual labor around the Rockefeller home. The boys were given adult responsibilities at a young age, something which was hardly unusual in the 19th century, an era when children as young as 9 or 10 years old were often expected to contribute to the household finances by finding work of some kind. This caused John and William Jr. to mature quickly. John attended the school established by his father. Although he was not exceptionally bright, he had a natural aptitude for mental arithmetic. He was otherwise a quiet, introverted boy who lacked the exuberance of his peers, but he was patient. When playing chess or checkers, he would take his time considering every move, an approach which frustrated his opponents and caused them to lose. This habit of cool reflection was encouraged by his mother, who had much time and cause over the years to reflect on her impulsive decision to marry the erratic and errant Bill Rockefeller. John also owed his strong sense of faith to his mother, who took her children to the local Baptist church. The 1840s was a time of economic and territorial expansion in the United States, and John D. Rockefeller exhibited an entrepreneurial spirit characteristic of the era from a very early age. As a boy, he bought candy from the store by the pound, divided it into smaller portions, and sold it to his siblings at a profit. At the age of 7, he came upon a nest of turkey chicks in the woods and raised them at home for sale. Among Bill's few legitimate ventures was a lumber business in Moravia. When John was just 8 or 9 years old, his father took him into the timber yards, teaching him how to judge the strength and quality of wood, lessons meant for building a family home, but also for shaping a businessman. Bill was a ruthless negotiator, quick to exploit the ignorance of customers if it gave him an edge. Yet he was not without his own code. He paid his workers generously, settled his debts on time, and honored his contracts. Years later, John's own approach to business would mirror much of what he learned from his father, minus the chaos that followed Bill wherever he went. In 1849, after being indicted for sexual assault, Bill Rockefeller abruptly left Moravia. By the spring of 1850, the family relocated to Oswego, near the Pennsylvania border. It was likely during this turbulent period that John stopped seeing his father as a hero and began to understand him for who he truly was. Jones soon started referring to his mother as a widow, and as an adult, he rarely spoke of his father at all. In August 1852, he and his brother William enrolled at the prestigious Owego Academy. Their education was short-lived. Within months, Bill uprooted the family once again, pushing west to Strongsville, Ohio. By the autumn of 1853, the Rockefeller boys resumed their studies at a higher school in nearby Cleveland. This was a nation on the move, as settlers surged toward the Pacific, driven by the promise of gold in California. America was tearing itself apart over the question of slavery. In his school essays, John Rockefeller emerged as a passionate abolitionist, echoing the ideals of the newly formed Republican Party. During this time, he forged a close friendship with Mark Hanna, who would later rise to become one of the most powerful Republican power brokers in the country and a U.S. Senator from New York. During John's childhood, the family moved frequently, first to Moravia, New York, then to Owego in 1851, where he attended Owego Academy. 2 years later, they relocated again, this time to Strongsville, Ohio. There, John enrolled at Cleveland's Central High School, the city's first high school and the first free public high school west of the Allegheny Mountains. He later completed a 10-week business course at Folsom's Commercial College, studying bookkeeping and the fundamentals of commerce. Despite the instability at home and the constant relocations, John Rockefeller was a serious, disciplined, and studious boy. Those who knew him described him as reserved, methodical, deeply religious, and discreet. He spoke carefully, argued precisely, and excelled in debate. Beyond numbers and ledgers, he also possessed a genuine love of music, so strong that for a time he even dreamed of pursuing it as a career.
John dreamed of going to university. But in May 1855, just days before his graduation, that future was abruptly taken from him. His father ordered him to leave school and find a job immediately. The demand was sudden and deeply unwelcome. Behind it lay the secret life Bill Rockefeller was now struggling to sustain. For years, Bill had roamed across the frontier, posing as a traveling doctor, even crossing into Canada. In 1852, in Ontario, he met and fell in love with 17-year-old Margaret Allen. As he courted her, Bill conveniently omitted one crucial detail: a wife and 5 children waiting for him south of the border. In June 1855, William Rockefeller went so far as to marry Allen, entering into a bigamous union. The reality soon caught up with him. Unable to financially support 2 families, William turned to his eldest son, urging John to shoulder the burden and go to work. After completing a 3-month course at a commercial college, John began his job search in August. He carefully wrote down the names of every business he hoped to work for and knocked on their doors himself, asking whether they needed a bookkeeper. Weeks passed with no success. His father even suggested that John could always join him on the road, wandering from town to town. The thought was unbearable. Instead of breaking him, it hardened his resolve. John kept searching, and on September 26, 1855, a small merchant firm, Hewitt & Tuttle, finally gave him a chance, hiring him as an assistant bookkeeper. John would remember that date for the rest of his life, celebrating it as Job Day. He threw himself into the work with total devotion, scrutinizing every bill and invoice, accounting for every single cent to protect his employers from being cheated. He arrived at the office at 6:30 each morning and often did not return home until after 10 at night. For John Rockefeller, this was more than a job. It was the beginning of a life defined by discipline, precision, and relentless work. He worked long hours and delighted, as he later recalled, in all the methods and systems of the office. He was particularly adept at calculating transportation costs, which served him well later in his career. Much of Rockefeller's duties involved negotiating with barge canal owners, ship captains, and freight agents. In these negotiations, he learned that posted transportation rates that were believed to be fixed could be altered depending on conditions and timing of freight and through the use of rebates to preferred shippers. Rockefeller was also given the duties of collecting debts when Hewitt instructed him to do so. Instead of using his father's method of presents to collect debts, Rockefeller relied on a persistent pestering approach. Rockefeller received $16 a month for his 3-month apprenticeship. In his first year, he received $31 a month, which was increased to $50 a month. His final year provided him with $58 a month. As a youth, Rockefeller reportedly said that his two great ambitions were to make $100,000, equivalent to $3.37 million in 2024 dollars, and to live 100 years. Despite the economic downturn of 1857, Bill Rockefeller was still doing well financially. Confident in his position, he decided to build a large house in downtown Cleveland, bringing his first family under one roof for the first time in years. While Bill provided the money, the responsibility fell to John. He oversaw the construction, supervised the contractors, and handled every payment. John managed the project with discipline and precision. His success seemed to convince Bill that his eldest son was now capable of acting as head of the family. With that, Bill quietly stepped away, leaving Cleveland behind to live permanently with his second wife in Philadelphia. Though he would resurface in John's life from time to time over the years, there is a deep irony in his departure. The predatory father detached himself from his first family just as his son was beginning a journey that would make him the richest man in the world. Had Bill known how vast John's fortune would become, he almost certainly would have stayed close, hoping to claim a share of it. In January 1857, after junior partner Henry Tuttle left the firm, John Rockefeller was promoted to chief bookkeeper. His salary? $500 a year, far below the $2,000 Tuttle had earned. Even after a modest raise to $600, John remained dissatisfied. Quietly, he began trading commodities on his own account, testing his instincts beyond the ledger books. As tensions over pay dragged on, John took a decisive step. In April 1858, he and his English friend Maurice B. Clark formed their own trading house. Each partner committed $2,000 in capital. John managed to save half of his share, borrowing the remaining $1,000 from his father at a steep 10% interest. The partnership flourished. In its first year, it earned $4,400 in profit. In the second, $17,000. But success came with risk. The commodities trade was volatile, and maintaining cash flow meant constant pressure to pay suppliers. John was forced to return repeatedly to his father for loans Bill often called in at the worst possible moments. John's appetite for bold, high-risk deals, many of which paid off handsomely, soon clashed with Clark's more cautious temperament. To stabilize the firm, a third partner was brought in during April 1859, George Gardner, a former colleague of Clark's from one of Cleveland's most prominent families and a man who would later become the city's mayor. But tensions lingered. John felt slighted when Clark unilaterally renamed the firm Clark, Gardner & Company. He was further irritated when Gardner purchased a yacht with friends and invited John along for a leisurely Saturday sail. To Rockefeller, such indulgence was more than frivolous. It threatened the firm's reputation for discipline and its ability to secure credit. In late 1862, Gardner withdrew from the partnership, and the firm returned to being Clark and Rockefeller. The timing could not have been better. John Rockefeller was now poised to chart his own course, just as the United States stood on the edge of unprecedented expansion. The nation was growing rapidly. The end of the Mexican-American War and the discovery of gold in California in 1948 had thrown open the vast American West. Opportunity was spreading, raw, chaotic, and immense. And John Rockefeller was ready to seize it.
As the conflict dragged on, Rockefeller looked beyond wartime trading. With the end of the war in sight and the inevitable decline of military profits, Clark and Rockefeller began searching for the next opportunity. Their attention turned to a new and volatile industry, the refining of crude oil. While his brother Frank fought on the battlefield, John remained behind to manage the business. Like many wealthy Northerners who stayed out of combat, he contributed financially to the Union cause. "I wanted to go in the army and do my part," Rockefeller later said, "but it was simply out of the question. There was no one to take my place. We were in a new business, and if I had not stayed, it must have stopped, and with so many dependent on it." Rockefeller opposed slavery, but never joined the abolitionist movement. Politically, he aligned himself with the rising Republican Party and cast his vote for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. The war transformed the oil market. Military demand pushed prices from just 35 cents a barrel in 1862 to as high as $13.75. The sudden riches triggered an oil boom. Thousands of speculators rushed into drilling, hoping to strike it rich. Most failed, and even those who succeeded often operated with shocking waste, blasting holes into the ground, scooping up what they could, and allowing rivers and creeks to run black with spilled oil instead of water. Out of this chaos, a new kind of businessman would emerge, one who believed that efficiency, discipline, and control mattered more than luck. And John D. Rockefeller was watching closely. By the early 1860s, a clear market had emerged for refined oil, kerosene. Until then, kerosene had been extracted from coal, a slow and costly process that kept it out of reach for most households. Oil-based kerosene changed everything. Even with high transportation costs and a Civil War-era government tax of 20 cents per gallon on refined oil, the profits were substantial.
In 1863, refined oil sold for roughly $13 a barrel, with profit margins ranging from $5 to $8 per barrel. Entry costs were remarkably low. Building a refinery required as little as $1,000 to $1,500 and only a handful of workers to operate. It was a perfect environment for both speculation and waste. Amid this chaotic boom, Rockefeller and his partners made a decisive pivot. They abandoned the food trade and entered the oil business, constructing a refinery in 1863 in the Flats, Cleveland's rapidly expanding industrial district. The refinery was owned by Andrews, Clark and Company, a partnership that brought together Clark and Rockefeller, chemist Samuel Andrews, and the two brothers of Maurice B. Clark. At the time, the commercial oil industry was still in its infancy. Whale oil, the traditional fuel for lighting, had become prohibitively expensive, and the nation was desperate for a cheaper, widely available alternative. Kerosene filled that need. Most refineries focused only on kerosene, which made up about 60% of the oil they processed. The remaining 40% was considered worthless and was routinely dumped into rivers or left in vast sludge piles. Rockefeller saw opportunity where others saw waste. He used gasoline to power the refinery itself and sold the remainder as lubricating oil, petroleum jelly, paraffin wax, and other byproducts. Tar was repurposed for paving, and naphtha was shipped to gas plants. Efficiency became an obsession. Rockefeller's refineries hired their own plumbers, cutting the cost of laying pipes in half. Barrels that normally cost $2.50 apiece were produced for just 96 cents by purchasing the wood directly and manufacturing them in-house. Every unnecessary expense was hunted down and eliminated.
In February 1865, Rockefeller made what oil historian Daniel Yergin would later describe as a critical move. At auction, he bought out the Clark brothers for $72,500, about $1 million in today's money, and formed a new firm, Rockefeller and Andrews. "It was the day that determined my career," Rockefeller later said. The timing was perfect. The Civil War had ended, the nation was surging westward, railroads were expanding, and the American economy was being reshaped by oil. Rockefeller borrowed aggressively, reinvested nearly all profits, adapted quickly to shifting markets, and deployed observers to monitor the rapidly evolving industry. In 1866, John's brother William Rockefeller Jr. built a second refinery in Cleveland and brought John into the venture. A year later, in 1867, Henry Morrison Flagler joined the partnership. The firm was renamed Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. By 1868, the strategy was clear and devastatingly effective. Through relentless cost control, reinvestment, and the full utilization of refinery waste, the company now owned 2 refineries in Cleveland and a marketing subsidiary in New York. It had become the largest oil refining operation in the world. Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler was the foundation from which a new corporate giant would soon emerge. It was the direct predecessor of Standard Oil. By 1865, Cleveland had risen to become one of the 5 major oil refining centers in the United States, alongside Pittsburgh, upstate New York, in the oil fields of northwestern Pennsylvania, where the crude itself was drawn from the ground. Just 4 years later, by 1869, the industry had built nearly 3 times more kerosene refining capacity than the market could absorb. The surplus would linger for years, creating a brutal, overcrowded battleground. Amid this pressure cooker environment, John D. Rockefeller made his most consequential move yet. On January 10, 1870, he dissolved the partnership of Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler and co-founded a new corporation, Standard Oil of Ohio. Applying the same relentless discipline that had defined his rise, Rockefeller drove the company forward with unmatched efficiency. Standard Oil quickly became the most profitable refinery in the state and soon one of the largest shippers of oil and kerosene in the entire country. Transportation was everything. Railroads fought fiercely for freight, slashing prices to secure steady, high-volume customers. In an effort to regain control over shipping rates, several rail lines attempted to form a cartel known as the South Improvement Company. Its goal was simple: stabilize freight prices by offering secret preferential deals to major shippers, especially those operating outside the main oil-producing regions.
Standard Oil was the perfect candidate. As a bulk customer, Rockefeller's company received extraordinary advantages, deep discounts and rebates of up to 50% on its own shipments. Even more controversially, the cartel promised rebates on oil shipped by Standard Oil's competitors, meaning Rockefeller's company profited not only from its own success, but from the business of its rivals. It was a system that would soon ignite outrage across the oil fields, and it marked the beginning of Standard Oil's transformation from a successful refinery into an industrial force capable of reshaping an entire industry. A key part of the scheme was the sudden announcement of sharply increased freight charges. The move ignited a firestorm. Independent oil producers erupted in protest, organizing boycotts, sabotaging equipment, and demanding answers. It did not take long for the truth to surface. Standard Oil was at the center of the deal. Opposition quickly coalesced. One of the most powerful voices came from New York, where the major refining firm Charles Pratt and Company, led by Charles Pratt and Henry H. Rogers, took the lead in resisting the plan. Under mounting pressure, the railroads retreated. Pennsylvania revoked the cartel's charter, and for the moment, non-preferential freight rates were restored. Competitors were furious, but the outcome was more complicated than outrage alone. Rockefeller's methods, however controversial, did result in cheaper kerosene and oil byproducts for American consumers. Before 1970, artificial light had largely been a luxury, dependent on costly whale oil. Within a decade, kerosene had become affordable and widespread, illuminating the homes of working and middle-class families across the country. Rockefeller, undeterred and now vilified by the press for the first time, pressed on. He doubled down on a self-reinforcing strategy, acquiring the weakest refiners, relentlessly improving efficiency, squeezing shipping costs, undercutting competitors' prices, striking secret deals, pooling capital, and buying rivals out, one by one. The result was swift and devastating. In less than 4 months in 1872, during what would later be known as the Cleveland Conquest, or more darkly, the Cleveland Massacre, Standard Oil absorbed 22 of the city's 26 competing refineries. Resistance continued, but the outcome was becoming inevitable. Even Rockefeller's former adversaries, Charles Pratt and Henry H. Rogers, eventually recognized the futility of fighting on. In 1874, they quietly struck a secret agreement with Rockefeller and allowed their firm to be absorbed. Standard Oil was no longer just a dominant player. It was becoming unavoidable. Charles Pratt and Henry H. Rogers did not disappear. They became Rockefeller's partners. Rogers, in particular, emerged as one of Rockefeller's most trusted lieutenants and would play a central role in shaping what became the Standard Oil Trust.
Pratt's son, Charles Millard Pratt, was appointed Secretary of Standard Oil, further binding former rivals into the growing empire. For many competitors, Rockefeller did not need threats or theatrics. He simply opened his books and showed them the numbers. The message was clear. This was what they were up against. He would then make what he considered a fair offer. If it was rejected, Rockefeller was blunt. He would undercut them, drive them into bankruptcy, and purchase their assets cheaply at auction. Yet Rockefeller did not believe competition should disappear entirely. As Pratt himself once observed, "Competitors we must have. If we absorb them, it surely will bring up another." Rockefeller saw himself not as a destroyer, but as the industry's savior, an angel of mercy absorbing weak firms and imposing order on chaos. Under his direction, Standard Oil expanded both horizontally and vertically. The company built its own pipelines, manufactured its own tank cars, and created a home delivery network that reached directly to consumers. Prices were kept deliberately low, sometimes even below cost, to discourage new rivals and make oil products affordable to ordinary families. Standard Oil relentlessly widened its reach, developing more than 300 oil-based products, from tar and paint to petroleum jelly and even chewing gum. By the end of the 1870s, Standard Oil refined more than 90% of all oil produced in the United States. Rockefeller himself had already become a millionaire, an almost unimaginable fortune at the time, equivalent to more than $30 million today. At the core of it all was an idea that came to Rockefeller instinctively. He believed order could only emerge through centralized control, through the coordination of production, transportation, refining, and distribution under a single command. The goal was simple: a smooth, efficient flow of goods from producer to consumer. Years later, a successor at Standard Oil of Ohio would reflect on what Rockefeller had created. That orderly, economic, efficient flow is what we now call vertical integration. I do not know whether Mr. Rockefeller ever used the word integration. I only know he conceived the idea. It was a vision that would redefine American business and reshape capitalism itself. In 1877, Standard Oil collided with one of the most powerful figures in American transportation, Thomas A. Scott, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Standard's primary carrier. Rockefeller had begun to see the future clearly. Railroads were no longer just partners, they were vulnerabilities. Pipelines, he believed, could become an independent system for moving oil, cheaper, faster, and beyond railroad control. Standard launched an aggressive campaign to build and acquire pipelines. The railroad industry responded immediately. Seeing Rockefeller's move as a direct threat, the Pennsylvania Railroad struck back, creating a subsidiary to purchase and construct oil refineries and pipelines of its own. A corporate war followed. Standard Oil retaliated by withholding shipments. With the quiet support of rival railroads, Rockefeller triggered a brutal price war that slashed freight rates, squeezed profits, and ignited labor unrest along the rail lines. In the end, Rockefeller prevailed. The Pennsylvania Railroad capitulated, selling its oil interests to Standard Oil. Victory came at a cost. In 1879, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania indicted Rockefeller on charges of monopolizing the oil trade. The case opened the floodgates. Similar legal actions soon followed in other states, turning Standard Oil's business practices into a national controversy. The pressure was relentless. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, as Rockefeller pushed forward with his plan of consolidation and vertical integration, he faced constant attacks from politicians, journalists, and competitors. The strain took a personal toll. Sleep became elusive. Looking back years later, Rockefeller admitted the price he had paid. "All the fortune that I have made has not served me to compensate me for the anxiety of that period. It was the cost of building an empire and of reshaping American industry in the process." Although Standard Oil always faced hundreds of competitors, it steadily tightened its grip on the industry. Through relentless horizontal integration, the company absorbed rival refiners and expanded its market share until it controlled nearly 90% of oil refining and sales in the United States. In kerosene, Standard dismantled the old distribution model and replaced it with a tightly controlled vertical system of its own. Oil moved by Standard-owned tank cars directly to local markets, where tank wagons delivered it straight to retailers, bypassing the traditional network of wholesale middlemen. The result was greater consistency, wider availability, and dramatically lower prices. Over the lifetime of the company, the cost of kerosene fell by nearly 80%, bringing affordable light to millions of American households. But efficiency came at a price. Standard Oil's methods provoked fierce controversy. Its most powerful weapons were underselling, differential pricing, and secret transportation rebates, tools that allowed Rockefeller to pressure competitors until many were forced to sell or shut down. From its earliest years, the company was under constant attack from journalists and politicians. These battles fueled the growing antitrust movement, which increasingly viewed Standard Oil as a threat to fair competition. In 1879, investigations by the Hepburn Committee of the New York State Legislature exposed what critics suspected. Standard Oil was receiving substantial freight rebates on virtually all oil shipped by rail, advantages that helped it crush its rivals. By 1880, public condemnation had reached a boiling point. The New York World declared Standard Oil the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. Rockefeller did not deny that mistakes had been made, but he rejected the image of deliberate wrongdoing. As he responded to critics, "In a business so large as ours, some things are likely to be done which we cannot approve. We correct them as soon as they come to our knowledge." To Rockefeller, Standard Oil was order imposed on chaos. To his critics, it was monopoly incarnate. And the battle between those two visions was far from over. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil had become a sprawling empire, but managing it was a challenge. At the time, state laws made it difficult to operate across borders. Rockefeller and his associates found themselves owning dozens of separate corporations, each confined to a single state. The result was a cumbersome, fragmented structure, efficient only in vision, not in practice. In 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers devised an innovative solution, the Standard Oil Trust. This was a corporation of corporations, a central entity that consolidated control over 41 separate companies. 9 trustees, including Rockefeller himself, oversaw the enterprise. The move drew immediate attention. The public and the press were suspicious of this legal innovation, and other businesses quickly copied the model, further inflaming popular sentiment. Standard Oil now projected an aura of invincibility. It triumphed over competitors, withstood critics, and faced political attacks seemingly without faltering. By any measure, it had become the richest, largest, and most feared business in the world, an empire that appeared immune to the booms and busts of the market, reliably generating profit year after year. Its American holdings were staggering: 20,000 oil wells, 4,000 miles of pipelines, 5,000 tank cars, and over 100,000 employees. At its height, the trust controlled over 90% of global oil refining, though that figure slowly fell to around 80% by the century's close. Even with this dominance, Rockefeller recognized limits. By the 1880s, he conceded that controlling all the world's oil refining was impossible. "We realized that public sentiment would be against us if we actually refined all the oil," he later admitted. Yet innovation never stopped. In the early 1880s, Rockefeller pioneered a new method of market influence. Rather than manipulating crude oil prices directly, Standard Oil used storage charges in its pipelines to subtly control supply and demand. Taking it a step further, Rockefeller introduced certificates against oil stored in Standard's pipelines. These certificates could be traded by speculators, creating the first oil futures market,
a mechanism that effectively set spot prices for the industry.
In late 1882, the National Petroleum Exchange opened in Manhattan to formalize this trading. Rockefeller's vision had transformed oil from a regional commodity into a globally monitored market, setting the stage for modern energy trading. By the 1880s, Pennsylvania still produced 85% of the world's crude oil, but the landscape was beginning to change. New oil fields in Russia and Asia were entering the global market, offering abundant supplies at lower costs. Robert Noble had already established his own refining empire in Russia, building the region's first pipeline and even the world's first oil tanker. The Paris Rothschilds stepped in with financing, fueling the expansion of this international competition. Additional discoveries in Burma and Java further chipped away at Standard Oil's dominance. At the same time, technology threatened to disrupt the very product that had made Rockefeller's fortune. The invention of the light bulb gradually began to diminish the world's dependence on kerosene for illumination. True to form, Standard Oil adapted. The company built a European presence, expanded into natural gas production across the United States, and began producing gasoline for automobiles, a product once considered little more than waste. By transforming a byproduct into a fuel for the emerging automobile age, Rockefeller once again demonstrated his ability to anticipate the next wave of demand, securing Standard Oil's position in a changing world. By the late 19th century, John D. Rockefeller's fortune had grown to around $100 million, making him the target of relentless criticism. Journalists and reformers painted him as the embodiment of industrial inequality, contrasting his vast wealth with the near poverty of American factory and refinery workers. Among his fiercest critics was Henry Demarest Lloyd, who, from the late 1870s, published scathing articles alleging that Standard Oil had built its monopoly through secret deals with the railroads. Lloyd's sources were telling. Former Standard employees racked with conscience, and independent refiners whom Rockefeller had either absorbed or driven out of business. The accusations gained traction, and in 1887, Congress established the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate freight rates. But for Standard Oil, the impact was minimal. By then, most of the company's oil flowed through its own pipelines, cutting dependence on the railroads entirely.
Congress tried again. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 aimed to outlaw monopolistic behavior, and in 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil of Ohio to dissolve its trust. Rockefeller adapted quickly. He transformed Standard Oil of New Jersey, chartered under New Jersey law but headquartered at 26 Broadway, into a holding company, allowing him to maintain centralized control over the sprawling enterprise. Rockefeller's influence even extended into the steel industry. In 1893, he clashed with tycoon Andrew Carnegie, who objected to Rockefeller's investments in iron ore. The dispute made easy fodder for newspaper cartoonists, but the men soon struck a deal. Carnegie would buy Rockefeller's ore, and Rockefeller promised not to compete in steel. That same year, Rockefeller purchased the estate of Pocantico Hills, about 20 miles north of New York City. It became a sanctuary, a place to step back from the pressures of business. His mother had passed in March 1889, and his father, ever elusive, lived until 1906. Rockefeller himself struggled with alopecia, a rare disease that caused him to lose the bushy mustache that had once defined his face. By the mid-1890s, Rockefeller began delegating. In 1897, he left John Dustin Archbold in charge of day-to-day operations at Standard Oil, while retaining his title of president and a controlling 30% stake. His son, John Jr., acted as vice president and liaison, keeping him informed of the company's inner workings. Outside the boardroom, Rockefeller embraced new pursuits. In 1999, he took up golf, building courses at both his New York and Cleveland estates. Politically, he remained active. In 1996, he donated to Republican candidate William McKinley, whose campaign was managed by Rockefeller's old school friend Mark Hanna.
McKinley defeated progressive Democrat William Jennings Bryan, securing Rockefeller's interests and giving him a measure of political reassurance as he continued to consolidate his legacy. Meanwhile, the political landscape was shifting. President William McKinley won re-election in 1900, but his assassination in 1901 thrust his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, into the White House. A progressive Republican, Roosevelt quickly earned a reputation as a trustbuster, filing suit after suit against monopolies under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Pro-business Republicans, initially aligned with Rockefeller ally Mark Hanna, reluctantly backed Roosevelt's 1904 re-election campaign after Hanna's death, signaling a delicate truce between big business and government. Standard Oil, however, faced an even more relentless opponent, the press. From 1902 to 1904, journalist Ida Tarbell published a landmark expose in McClure's magazine. Having grown up in Titusville, where her father operated an oil business destroyed by Standard's tactics, Tarbell documented the company's industrial espionage, price manipulation, and secretive ownership structures. Publicly, Rockefeller refused to comment, but privately he was furious, especially when reporters unearthed details of his father's bigamous marriage, long known to John but made public in 1908.
Standard fought back. The company sponsored favorable books and articles, while Rockefeller sought to protect his reputation by inviting journalists to his golf courses at Pocantico Hills. Yet the legal and political pressure mounted. Federal and state governments filed numerous lawsuits, and Rockefeller often went to great lengths to avoid being served court papers. In a high-profile 1907 case, federal judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis fined Standard over $29 million for railroad rebate violations. Standard appealed, and in 1908, the judgment was overturned. That same year, Rockefeller threw his support behind William Howard Taft, the Ohio Republican, to succeed Roosevelt. Though more conservative, Taft expanded Roosevelt's trust-busting campaign rather than curtail it.
Legally, Standard Oil continued to adapt. In 1909, New Jersey had revised its laws to formalize the company's holding structure, but courts remained unsatisfied. In a landmark decision, a circuit court ordered Standard to break up for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Appeals dragged on, but in May 1911, the Supreme Court delivered the final verdict, giving the trust 6 months to dissolve. By that time, Standard Oil still controlled 14% of global crude oil supply and 70% of the U.S. refined oil market. Rockefeller stepped down as president of Standard Oil of New Jersey, which remained the largest single entity held by the Rockefeller family. Shareholders received stakes in 34 independent companies that emerged from the breakup, many of which would go on to become the giants of the 20th century: Conoco, Chevron, Exxon, and Mobil. The breakup marked the end of an era, but Rockefeller's influence on American industry, law, and philanthropy would endure for generations. The breakup of Standard Oil did more than reshape industry. It gave the American public a chance to buy shares in the formerly monopolistic giant. Demand soared, stocks skyrocketed, and by 1916, John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire. Flush with wealth, Rockefeller turned his attention once again to philanthropy. In 1913, he proposed the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation, chartered in New York. He contributed a staggering $183 million, focusing primarily on global health initiatives and support for medical schools. Over time, Rockefeller passed much of his fortune to his children, especially John Jr., who had been helping manage the family's investments and served as president of the Rockefeller Foundation. John Jr. had resigned from Standard's board in 1910 amid a bribery scandal involving John Dustin Archbold, devoting himself instead to philanthropic work. Yet even the Rockefellers were not without controversy. In 1913, Colorado Fuel and Iron, in which John Sr. held controlling shares, faced a strike by the union miner workers over unsafe conditions. John Jr., acting as director, supported the company's harsh efforts to break the strike. In April 1914, Colorado National Guardsmen and private company guards attacked the workers, killing more than 20 men, women, and children. Though John Sr. supported his son's decisions, he recognized the public relations disaster. The family used Rockefeller Foundation funds to aid the families of the victims, attempting to repair some of the damage. That September, John and Laura Rockefeller celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at their Pocantico estate. Though her health was failing, she passed away the following spring.
In her memory, Rockefeller endowed the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Foundation with $74 million, focusing on religious and educational causes, a foundation that would later merge with the Rockefeller Foundation. World events also reshaped Rockefeller's image. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, he purchased war bonds and supported Allied causes through his philanthropic work, earning renewed public respect. He marveled at the irony of governments encouraging oil companies to collaborate to fuel military vehicles. In 1918, Rockefeller bought a winter home, the Casements, in Ormond Beach, Florida, across from the Ormond Hotel built decades earlier by his former partner, Henry Flagler. Rockefeller had avoided Florida while Flagler was alive, but after Flagler's death in 1913, he began visiting, enjoying the subtropical retreat. For the final 2 decades of his life, Rockefeller devoted himself to social, religious, and philanthropic causes, finding satisfaction in reforms like the prohibition of alcohol in 1920 under the 18th Amendment. Despite his immense wealth and fame, Rockefeller's later years were defined not by industry, but by his vision of charity, morality, and social responsibility. In his later years, Rockefeller witnessed the consequences of prohibition, which had spawned a thriving black market. By the time it was repealed in 1933, he had come to accept that the policy had created more problems than it solved. Even in retirement, Rockefeller remained engaged in business. During the Wall Street crash of 1929, he lost nearly half of his remaining fortune, yet he remained undeterred. Seizing opportunity, he purchased 1 million shares of Standard Oil of New Jersey, now entering a new phase of expansion under its third president, Walter Clark Teagle, the grandson of Rockefeller's original business partner, Maurice Clark. Meanwhile, John Jr. helped revive New York City's economy by financing the construction of Rockefeller Center, one of the world's largest commercial complexes. Despite his legendary secrecy and discipline as a businessman, Rockefeller grew into a jovial octogenarian, maintaining the wish to reach 100. He fell just short, passing away early on the morning of May 23, 1937, a few weeks shy of his 98th birthday. His body was transported by train from the Casements to Pocantico, where Standard Oil companies worldwide paused for a 5-minute silence in his honor. He was laid to rest at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, beside his mother and wife, beneath a 70-foot obelisk, the largest funeral monument in America at the time. John D. Rockefeller was more than a titan of industry. He was a defining figure of America's Gilded Age. Shaped by his mother's Baptist faith and his father's often dubious money-making strategies, he transformed a fledgling oil industry into a global enterprise. Critics condemned his secretive business arrangements and monopolistic methods, yet Rockefeller defended them as necessary to stabilize an industry at risk of self-destruction. He never achieved absolute monopoly. Over time, international competition and government regulation eroded his market dominance. By the 1990s, Rockefeller had stepped back from daily operations at Standard Oil and dedicated himself to philanthropy, leaving a legacy that endures through the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and the Rockefeller Foundation. His family would continue to shape American business and politics for generations. His grandson, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, served as governor of New York during the construction of the World Trade Center in 1973, and later as vice president under Gerald Ford. Another grandson, Winthrop Rockefeller, became governor of Arkansas. John Jr.'s grandson, John D. Rockefeller IV, J., served as governor and later senator of West Virginia.
His son, David Rockefeller, played a central role in international finance and civic life. John D. Rockefeller not only built an empire so vast that the U.S. government had to break it up in 1911, he also founded one of America's most enduring business and political dynasties. And so, the story of John D. Rockefeller, industrialist, philanthropist, and architect of American capitalism, remains a testament to ambition, strategy, and influence that shaped a nation. Thank you very much for watching.